Tell me about that day, October 20th. How did you wind up with a gun in your hand?
We always did a lot of hunting and a lot of target shooting, so there was a lot of guns in the house. I went and got the gun from my dad's closet.
Why did you go get the gun to begin with?
I was angry at my dad. He was firm about it, adamant about it, that there would be none of this, and that's the way it was going to be. And so that created a lot of resentment and a lot of anger.
On October 20th, 2007, the typical calm of Wellington, a small town in Ohio, was brutally shattered that night in a suburban house. A teenager, just 16 years old, entered his parents' room with a decision made. Minutes later, the police received a grim call. What seemed like a simple family crime quickly turned into a case that attracted nationwide attention. The young man responsible for the attack was not a common delinquent, nor did he have a violent record. He was the youngest son of a deeply religious family, raised under strict moral norms. As the investigation progressed, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together around his obsession: a video game. The story of Daniel Petric was shocking not only for its violence but also for the debate it sparked across the United States about the limits of censorship, the influence of video games, and the dangers of the most macabre fanaticism. Good evening. Welcome to Criminalista Nocturno. No, Daniel Petric, or simply Danny, as his acquaintances called him, was born on August 24, 1991, in Wellington, a small town of just over 5,000 inhabitants located in Lorain County, Ohio. He was the youngest son of Mark and Susan Petric, a deeply religious family. His father was a pastor at the New Life Assembly of God Church, a Pentecostal Christian temple where spiritual life governed every aspect of daily life. During his childhood, Danny was homeschooled. His parents were convinced that education should come from them and through faith. It wasn't until his sophomore year of high school that he entered the public Wellington High School. There, he became just another student, quiet, without outstanding grades, but without behavioral issues. He shared his home with his two older sisters, Heidi, married to a young youth pastor, and Holly, who attended the same school as him. No one in his circle could have imagined what would happen a few years later. Danny was a likable kid, the kind who always had a ready smile. He enjoyed playing the drums, practicing sports, and participating in the church youth group, where he even stood out for his knowledge of the Bible. He could recite entire passages with surprising ease. He also went shooting with his father, a common activity in that region of the country. However, at 16 years old, everything changed. A skiing accident caused a severe spinal injury, and as if that weren't enough, he contracted a staph infection that left him immobilized for months. His health was so compromised that any small blow could have left him paralyzed. Confined to his home, unable to go to school or attend church, Danny fell into deep isolation. It was in this context that his friend Jonathan Johnson introduced him to a video game that would change everything. Halo, an action saga with a futuristic aesthetic, loaded with violence and war themes. Danny became obsessed. He spent hours in front of the screen, completely immersed in a world of intergalactic combat. What started as a pastime to relieve boredom turned into an addiction and, with time, the trigger for a tragedy that shook the entire town of Wellington. Halo: Combat Evolved was released in November 2001 and quickly became one of the most popular video games of the decade. Designed by Bungie and distributed by Microsoft, it was the flagship title for the Xbox console. It marked a before and after in the first-person shooter genre with its cinematic narrative, sci-fi settings, and adrenaline-packed combat style. Halo attracted both young people and adults. In this sense, its success was not only commercial, it sold millions of copies and spawned several sequels, but it also generated a cultural phenomenon that led to tournaments, forums, a television series, merchandise, and a community that lived for each new release. For many teenagers, Halo was much more than a game. It was an escape and an alternative world. For Danny Petric, it was precisely that and much more. Danny ended up playing Halo for 7 to 8 hours a day at his friend Jonathan's house. His connection with the game grew at the same rate as his isolation and frustration. However, at home, the perspective was completely different. His father, Mark, did not tolerate this type of content. He saw violent video games as a negative influence, incompatible with the faith and values he preached. When Danny expressed his desire to have his own copy of the game, the response was definitive. Either he abandoned that addiction or he had to leave the house. In September 2007, the frenzy for Halo reached its peak with the release of Halo 3. In this installment, the player took on the role of the Master Chief, a genetically enhanced soldier fighting for the survival of the human species. Vehicles, advanced weaponry, and an online multiplayer mode made Halo 3 a mass phenomenon. In its first week alone, it grossed $300 million, and within hours of its release, over 1 million people were already playing it on Xbox Live. It was the best-selling game of 2007 in the United States, and to this day remains the most successful title in the series. Danny had no intention of being left out. He disobeyed his father's warnings, climbed out of his bedroom window, got the money, and bought the game. But the transgression was short-lived. When he returned home, his parents discovered it and immediately confiscated the disc. Mark locked it away in a safe where he also kept a Taurus PT-92 semi-automatic 9mm pistol. The argument was intense, especially between father and son. Upset, Danny went to spend the weekend at Jonathan's house. There, for 2 days, they played non-stop, 18 hours a day, with minimal breaks to sleep, eat, and use the bathroom. In that great digital marathon, Danny was not only escaping reality but also feeding a growing rage. His anger towards his father was increasing. For him, having Halo 3 taken away was more than a prohibition. It was an unforgivable offense. On October 20th, 2007, at 16 years old, Daniel Petric made a decision that would forever separate him from his previous life. 4 hours, he searched the entire house for a small key. He knew perfectly well what had opened: his father's safe. When he finally found it, he didn't hesitate. He opened it and took 2 things: his confiscated copy of Halo 3 and Mark's semi-automatic pistol. It was around 7 p.m. when he approached the living room where his parents were. He asked them to close their eyes because he had a surprise. Mark, not imagining what was about to happen, smiled and obeyed. He never would have expected Danny to draw the weapon and then fire. First, he aimed at his mother and shot her 3 times. Then he turned to his father and wounded him in the face. Mark felt tremendous pressure in his head, and blood began to stream down his face. When he came to, his gaze found Susan slumped in the armchair. 2 of the shots had passed through the woman's forearms as if she had tried to shield herself. The third, which hit her chest, was the one that ended her life. But the horror did not end at that moment. Danny took his father's bloody hand and forced it onto the gun's grip. He told him to hold it. He wanted to simulate a scene that looked like a homicide by his father against his mother, followed by a suicide, so that the blame would fall not on him, but on Mark himself, who had decided to take the game away from him. Minutes later, Heidi, Dana's older sister, arrived with her husband, Andy. The plan for that evening was to watch the Cleveland Indians game against Boston together, but Danny wasn't expecting them so early. Suddenly, he saw them arrive and was faced with the danger of his crime being discovered. From the entrance, he tried to stop them from coming in, saying that his parents were arguing, but something didn't add up. From inside be heard. Someone was whispering their names. Alarmed, Heidi and Andy pushed the door open and forced their way in. What they found was a scene as unimaginable as it was. Horrifying. Susan was no longer breathing, and Mark could barely stay conscious, his jaw completely shattered. He made a desperate effort to speak. He managed only to stammer, "My son shot me." Danny then tried to maintain his composure. He pointed to his father as the murderer, but Heidi didn't hesitate. She immediately called 911. At that moment, she noticed her brother still had the gun in his hand. Andy acted quickly and took it from him before he could do anything else. Danny didn't resist, but he didn't stay still either. He ran out and got into the family truck. He placed his video game on the passenger seat. His only goal was to escape. He planned to get to a friend's house in another state, but the escape attempt didn't last long. Just a few minutes later, he was stopped at a police checkpoint. When intercepted by a patrol car, he got out of the vehicle shouting that his father had been the one who killed his mother.
Its own discretion, perhaps reconsider that to a reasonable bond. And I would ask this, that the family has not visited this young man. If possible, the court could issue an order, or I'll draft up a motion if the court would prefer, on a contact visit with his family. He hasn't had any involvement with guilty courses here.
All right. Attorney Kersey is noted as private counsel. We'll retain Attorney Otero as guardian ad litem in this case. A motion so that the state can be heard on that.
Yes, sir.
We can do that at the first pretrial if you wish.
Okay, real good. Thank you.
December 21st, 9 a.m. you take on what happened to it?
Well, how are you doing? Yeah, what it is here, let me tell you how this is. I've been doing this a long time, 37 years. In football, college, high school, and pros, you get a flag for piling on. This indictment is piling on.
Why do you say that?
Well, because it's way over indicted, that's what I think. Way over what happened. That's all I know before I get into the facts.
Can you talk to us about him wanting to see his family?
Well, they haven't. I mean, this is a 16-year-old boy. Let him see. Let him visit with his family. I think that's a humanitarian thing to do. I mean, he's not going to Costa Rica.
What do you expect tomorrow?
Just a pre-trial. That's all.
Susan Petric, 43, had died instantly. The forensic report was clear. The impacts on her arms showed a desperate attempt to protect herself. Mark miraculously survived. He spent weeks in the hospital in critical condition and underwent 5 reconstructive surgeries. For investigators, there was one detail that proved impossible to ignore. While recounting what happened, Daniel sobbed, although his eyes remained dry. There were no signs of a teenager in shock after such a traumatic event. After several interrogations, Danny finally confessed. He was the one who had shot. He was the one who had tried to kill his father, and he was the one who had mercilessly murdered his mother. He had also tried to construct a useless lie. The story spread across all US media, not only because of the violence of the act but also because of the motive, a simple video game. The shocked community was quickly divided. Some called for life imprisonment for Daniel, others directly for the death penalty. On October 22, 2007, Daniel Petric was formally charged with aggravated murder, attempted murder, and evidence tampering. The Lorain County Prosecutor's Office pushed from the start for him to be tried as an adult despite his age. But not even at that point was everything clear, as during the investigation a fundamental question arose. Who was Daniel Petric really? An ordinary young man who had an episode of rage he couldn't control, or a psychopathic youth who had long been on the verge of exploding? The versions didn't match. Some friends describe him as kind and calm. Others define him as withdrawn with unpredictable reactions. Mark was still recovering from the physical aftermath of the attack, but the deeper wounds were others. He had lost his wife, the love of his life, at the hands of his own son. During the first days, he spoke of nothing but the pain and betrayal. However, as time passed, something changed. He started visiting Danny in jail, and when he was finally able to speak with him, he heard what he needed to hear most. His son apologized not only to him but also to his now absent mother and the rest of the family. Furthermore, he said he was grateful that his father had survived. In the weeks before the trial, a hearing was held in the county's juvenile court. Michael Brooke, Dana's grandfather, appeared. There, in his statement, he asked for his grandson to be released into family custody until the start of the trial. He said what had happened was an isolated incident, that the family had forgiven him, that his church had forgiven him, and that even God had already done so. He assured that Danny had always been an affectionate boy, with no history of violent behavior. If Susan and Mark were here, they would forgive him too, he said, convinced. During that hearing, Daniel appeared visibly gaunt. He had short hair, wore the standard uniform for juvenile detainees, and responded in a low, calm, almost absent voice. His lawyer argued that he was not a danger, that he had never had problems before, and that he deserved to await trial in freedom. He stated there was no flight risk and that the young man would live with his grandfather if granted that benefit. But the judge was firm and denied the request. He said the violence of the act did not allow it to be treated as a simple exceptional case, that beyond appearances, the magnitude of the crime required the young man to remain in custody until facing justice. The trial against Daniel Petric took place between December the 15th and 17th, 2008, in the Lorain County Court of Common Pleas. The young man waived his right to a jury trial, so the decision rested with Judge James Burge. During the hearings, about 25 people, mainly classmates and acquaintances, appeared to support him. Close relatives, his friend Jonathan, and his grandfather also testified. However, the heart of the trial was undoubtedly the clash between the two versions vying for the truth. The prosecutions, which pointed to meticulous planning, and the defenses, which alleged an emotional explosion motivated by video game addiction. Prosecutor Anthony Sillo left no room for doubt. He asserted that Daniel had acted with coldness and premeditation, that he had become enraged after his parents confiscated the video game that obsessed him, Halo 3, and that for this reason he decided to end their lives. According to the accusation, Daniel had called a friend that same morning to tell him his parents were arguing, and he shot at 7 p.m., calculating that his sister would only arrive 2 hours later, but his plan fell apart when Heidi and her husband arrived earlier than expected. The prosecutor emphasized that the young man not only did nothing to help his father after the attack, but also tried to manipulate the scene by placing the gun in his hand to make it look like a murder followed by a suicide between the two victims. He also cited a psychological report presented by the defense in which the professional Stephen A. Helser indicated that the boy confessed to having thought about the attack for at least a week, stating that he was going to stop living under his parents' rules. The prosecutor went further. He stated that a few days after the event, the accused continued to show a disturbing coldness, to the point of asking the agents interrogating him about the outcome of the baseball game his parents were going to watch that night, as if nothing had happened. The defense, led by lawyer James Hersey, focused its strategy on the young man's compulsive use of video games. They argued that Daniel was not a criminal, but a teenager absorbed by an addiction that had pushed him to the limit. They claimed that he played for 18 hours a day, that he had lost touch with reality, and that he simply collapsed that night. They also maintained that the crime was not premeditated and asked that his age be considered to reduce his criminal responsibility. However, they did not present any specialist to support the effect of the video games on Daniel's behavior, especially considering that when he fled the family home after the macabre attack, the only thing he took with him was the Halo 3 disc. Daniel's father also testified during the trial. He recounted in detail what happened that night and broke down when he stated that he had probably survived only because his daughter and son-in-law arrived earlier than expected. He said that his wife and Daniel had a very close relationship and that she had always protected him. He was his mom's favorite, he said with a broken voice. Daniel cried several times during the hearings. His father, despite everything, supported him, saying that the boy sincerely regretted what he had done and admitted that, despite everything, he still could not understand why his son had committed such an act. When images of Susan's autopsy were projected on screen, Daniel lowered his head and stared at his hands for several minutes. He said nothing, did not move, remained motionless while the experts explained each of the injuries his mother had suffered. For her part, his sister Heidi stated that the family had already forgiven him. She said that everyone wanted him to come home, that they could not begin to rebuild until they were all together. Danny had been forgiven by his entire family, but he could not be forgiven by the justice system. January 2009, the judge announced the verdict. Daniel Petric was found guilty of aggravated murder and evidence tampering. During the reading, the magistrate made an observation that drew attention. He blamed the video game more than Daniel himself. He said he was convinced that at the time he planned the attack, Daniel did not truly understand that murdering his parents meant they would be dead forever, that his mind, altered by his obsession with the video game, did not fully distinguish reality from fiction. The judge stated that the video game addiction had modified the young man's brain in a way comparable to the effect of drugs. When he stopped playing, his mind could not tolerate it. He also argued that, as a product of that obsession, Daniel had begun to see his parents as enemies, as if they were part of the challenges to overcome within the video game. And he went further. He stated that if it weren't for those violent games, Daniel Petric would probably never have been in that courtroom. 5 months later, on June 16, 2009, the sentencing hearing was held. His father Mark asked the court for clemency and said that his son was deeply remorseful and had expressed to him on many occasions how much he missed his mother. Daniel, for his part, barely listened to the sentence, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what was happening. He tried to remain calm, but when he stood up to address the court, he broke down in tears and couldn't utter a word. Because he was a minor at the time of the crime, he could not receive the death penalty. The prosecution had asked for life in prison without the possibility of parole, but the judge opted for the Minimum sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of release after 23 years. Daniel Petric was housed in the Grafton Correctional Institution, where he remains to this day. His father, who still bears the scars of the attack on his face, visits him regularly and supports him. Although he finds it hard to understand how everything changed so abruptly, Daniel could only apply for parole in the year 2030, when he will be 39 years old. In 2015, at the age of 24, he filed an appeal. He alleged that his lawyers had been negligent by not appealing the original sentence. According to Daniel, one of them convinced him that it was better to wait. He promised him that Ohio's law on the reduced capacity of defendants was going to be modified and that he could then request a new trial with a lower sentence. But that reform never came. However, Daniel's belated appeal was also not very useful and was rejected. He would have to serve his sentence as originally planned. After the trial, the debate focused on the role video games had played in this story. Microsoft, the developer of Halo 3, only issued a brief statement calling the case a tragedy. They didn't say much more. 2 years later, Mark Patrick appeared in the media again. He said that his son had clearly been obsessed with Halo and that in his opinion that addiction was what pushed him to shoot him and his wife. He declared himself an enemy of the video game industry, which he accused of putting weapons in the hands of kids and teaching them that murder is okay. He claimed that many of those games were not simple entertainment, but murder simulators. A Florida lawyer named Jack Thompson, who has been campaigning against the gaming industry for years, took up the case again in 2021. He argued that Daniel was not only addicted but had trained for months to murder his parents while playing. Thompson even launched a campaign to reopen the trial, arguing that the teenager had acted under a delusion induced by his obsession. For Thompson, the judge who presided over the case in 2009 was ahead of his time. By pointing to video games as part of the problem, he predicted a worrying trend. In his opinion, titles like Halo, Grand Theft Auto 4, or Bully are training a generation of young people with sniper skills and a deeply altered morality. But not everyone shares that view. On the other side, defenders of video games argue that the problem lies not with the game, but with pre-existing mental imbalances. Doug Lowenstein, founder of the Entertainment Software Association of the United States, said that if someone has a mind prone to crime, it's not the video game's fault, that those thoughts were already there and the games do nothing more than amplify them. Even the World Health Organization published a report on the matter. According to their studies, gaming disorder affects a small minority within the universe of gamers. A case that generated a shock similar to Daniel Petric's was that of Gabriel Kuhn in Brazil, although with an even more macabre outcome. In 2007, the same year that Daniel shot his parents, a Brazilian teenager named Daniel Petri, yes, with the same first name and an almost identical surname, brutally murdered another 12-year-old boy after an argument over credits for an online video game. The crime included torture, dismemberment, and violence so extreme that it still circulates on forums as one of the most disturbing stories linked to gaming. Although both cases are different in their context, it's impossible not to notice how two young people in the same year, with a direct link to video games, ended up committing atrocious crimes. The truth is, that October night in 2007, they believed they were setting a limit for Daniel Petric. They told him he couldn't play anymore, that his obsession had to end, and they never imagined that such a simple, so logical, command was going to trigger a tragedy. A tragedy in which a son transformed his own parents into enemies in a video game. Once again, dear audience, I thank you for your company. Thank you for being present in this new broadcast. Remember that you can follow me on social media. I am currently on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok Music, and Instagram. And you can also find me on any audio streaming platform of your choice. I say goodbye with a big hug, and if you are not yet subscribed, I cordially invite you to do so and become part of this great community. This is L Cheesy Life. Until the next broadcast. Good night.